which will now get started to be nice and punctual. Thank you all for joining us. This is the latest webinar organized by the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Good morning, good evening, good night. It's good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from for this webinar. We're delighted that you're able to join us. My name is Raffaello Pantucci. I'm a senior fellow at ICPVTR, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of a series that we're running, which is looking at questions of radicalization amongst diaspora communities. We did a first session a few months ago, which focused on Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular, which was very successful and uncovered some of the questions and issues around, migrant communities, how radicalization takes place amongst them, and how you can counter violent extremism, the spread of extremist ideas and terrorist ideas amongst such groups. We covered a whole lot of ground with that one. This second session is going to focus on Central Asia, and we're looking in particular at the questions of radicalization and extremism and the spread of extremist ideas and terrorist financing and other sort of related issues with Central Asian diaspora communities that exist, of course, across Europe, but increasingly also in parts of Asia as well. And then the final one, which will come in a couple of months, I think, is going to focus instead on South Asia. So make sure you're signed up and you'll be able to join us for that session. But before we get to that, we have a really wonderful session planned for you this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending on where you are, which focuses on Central Asia. We've got two really excellent experts who are going to be joining us to talk about these questions. First, we have Professor Magnus Ranstorp, who is Research Director at the Center for Asymmetric Threat Studies, which has the wonderful acronym CATS, the Swedish Defense University, and is also Quality Manager at the EU Radicalization Awareness Network Center of Excellence, the RAN-COE. So anyone who's looked at sort of terrorism and extremism knows Magnus and his long-standing research and focus on this subject in Europe, and in particular, actually looking at sort of Central Asian networks. So Magnus is going to talk first, and then after that, we're going to be joined by Mrs. Indira Aslanova, who I'll introduce properly after Magnus. Before we get going, some very brief housekeeping points. If you do have any questions or any points you'd like to raise, the way we do it is if you put it into the chat function. So feel free to put your questions in there as we go along. We'll hear our two presenters, and then we'll go into a sort of discussion, question-answer session. So anywhere along the discussion, if you come up with a question you want to put to our speakers, please feel free to put it into the box, and I will then put it to them as we go along. So I think without further ado, let me hand it over to Magnus, who will start us with his presentation. Magnus, please, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Raffaello Pantucci and the entire team at Nanyang for inviting me to this very difficult, very timely topic on diaspora radicalization. And I have to admit, I worked a long time on the issue, and the only country I've been to in Central Asia is Tajikistan. And there, of course, my experience was wonderful to visit the country, but also one of the drivers of radicalization in Tajikistan was the migrant workers to Russia who were discriminated, who were exploited, etc. So this is a very complex issue. I will speak today about the issue of Central Asian diaspora or the Caucasus and their diaspora communities in a Swedish setting or in a European setting. But I've really limited to Sweden just to sort of illustrate the sort of difficulty. Of course, migrant communities should not be just sort of securitized. Of course, migrant communities who come for asylum reasons, for economic reasons, for other reasons, they are, a part and parcel of society wherever they are. And of course, they distribute legitimate flows of remittances across the world. So we need to think beyond sort of national boundaries. We need to think about the financial flows and the transnational connections of all different communities. Now, I say this may be sort of obvious to everyone, but it's not always obvious to policymakers and to decision makers and to those who work in this arena in relation to this community. Let me also say, before I launch into my sort of presentation, that it's also interesting that there are, different collaborative relationships between different ethnic communities. And if you look at the way in which things are structured, particularly within the sort of violent extremism realm, you will see that there are different ethnic divisions. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they do not. But there are also different generational dimensions that you have to also think about. Those that have been in the game a long time, who've been fighting for the different groups, as well as the new generation that may not have such firm loyalties and so on. So bear that in mind. Now, I work, of course, at the Swedish Defense University in Stockholm. These are some of our publications. I know that you can probably only read on the left-hand side, Swedish foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. But please, you'll find all the publications if you visit our website at the Swedish Defense University. You can probably Google Translate. And we've done a lot of work on transnational extremism, violent extremism. We've done a lot of work on Salafism and Salafi jihadism. And our latest work has been on the Salafi jihadism and the digital media dimension, the online sphere in relation to this area. So let me bring you into then the Swedish dimension and the Central Asian diaspora in relation to violent extremism. But let me start with giving you some context. So we can start, next slide. Now, Sweden has been spared historically from terrorism, but of course that all changed on the 11th of December 2010, when you had Swede who had been resident in the United Kingdom, who traveled back to his home country and decided to undertake quite a sort of an extraordinary complex operation. And what he did was Taimur Abdul Wahab had been based in Luton, United Kingdom. He had traveled to Middle East. He had also other linkages across Europe, but he had traveled back to Sweden, and he had undertaken an operation that went, luckily, wrong. He had set fire to his car so that there were pyrotechnics and so on that was supposed to explode. You can see on a graph by the security service on the bottom right-hand corner that he had significant, explosives, etc., that he was trying to detonate. But he went into a side street, and that's the left-hand picture, and he checked the wiring, and then he exploded himself. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, this was a real wake-up call in relation to violent extremism in Sweden. The milieu, the environment, has been created over several decades, primarily from diaspora communities coming from conflicts in Algeria, in Morocco, in other North African countries, and across the Middle East. His failed attempt was really sort of the first wake-up call, and that was in December 2010. Next picture. Just 3 weeks later, you had another plot that was happening. So it was a very busy period for the Swedish security services. You had 4 Swedes who traveled to the newspaper Jyllandsposten in Denmark from Stockholm, that traveled to Copenhagen, Denmark. And you can see in relation to the plot, which they were convicted for, what was on the cards. They were trying to plan to do a Mumbai-style attack in Copenhagen, and of course, the motive was revenging controversial issues in relation to the publication of the Prophet Muhammad cartoons, the caricatures. But the most important thing, I think, was that this was not an unplanned attack. This was connected to Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan, and the terror attack was sanctioned by Abu Yahya al-Libi. 2 attacks in 2010, lots of activity. Most of the perpetrators were not from Central Asia, they were from the Middle East. You can go to the next picture. Most importantly, they would try to storm the paper and take as many people as hostage, and then beginning to execute. Why do I have this picture here with David Headley and the Mumbai attack in 2010? Well, the person on the right-hand side, David Headley, had begun planning an attack against the Danish paper Jyllands-Posten, and he was marking out the different positions for the attack for the Pakistani terror team that came in and attacked the different sort of targets. Before that, he had been to, after that, he went to Copenhagen and began planning the attack that I just showed you in relation to Jyllands-Posten. So we have had, some very serious terror attack with international, transnational connections. Next slide. But then, of course, it took 7 years with relatively little happening. But of course, the terror attack on the 7th of April, 2017 was really a shocking moment. We had the lorry, you can see that on the left-hand side. The terrorist Rahmat Akilov drove, or should we say hijacked the truck. He took the truck and he began driving in 90 kilometers down the most busy pedestrian street, killing 5 people, injuring lots of other people. And luckily, Swedish police caught him. And I think, here are some pictures from the 7th of April, 2017. You can also see the sort of response by the Swedish police and the crisis management that occurred. Luckily, there was no polarization in society. Police responded excellently, and the attack did not have this sort of intended effect. And luckily, we caught the person that had perpetrated this, and he's now convicted, and he is serving a long sentence in jail. Next picture. The person who did the attack did not come from the Middle East. His name was Rahmat Akilov. He had come to Sweden as an asylum seeker. He had been refused asylum status, so he was a denied asylum seeker. And you can see the numbers at the bottom there. Quite a lot of asylum seekers have been denied. A lot of them it's been difficult to sort of expel them on human rights grounds, etc. But there was the interesting dimension in relation to this was that he was in constant contact with 6 Tajik operational commanders as he was launching the attack, but also in preparation of the attack. The planned attack was made over the internet. The planned attack took 4 months to plan. There were lots of different other targets in view. He used cello. He was mainly using Bekontakt and Odnoklassniko, the social media services in Russia and for other Central Asian speaking communities. More importantly, he also supplied anonymous SIM cards to ISIS persons in Syria so that they could register to then sort of have numbers on WhatsApp. So as part of this sort of investigation, we also saw that there were lots of Swedish numbers popping up because they were giving sort of anonymous SIM cards so that they could register these sort of different numbers within sort of WhatsApp. I'll come back to the Asian, Central Asian dimension in a few minutes, but let me just give you some context on the CT environment in Sweden. Next one. Now, I'm not going to dwell very long on these slides. I'm just going to go over them relatively quickly. The security environment has been quite dramatic. I don't know if any one of you have been to Sweden. It's a country of 10 million people. We are very close to, we of course are at the Baltic Sea. We're close to Russia. It's cold where we are now, probably warm where you are, because autumn is setting in. We have, it's a small environment in relation to extremism, but you can see here from this graph and the former head of security service, Anders Thornberg, who's now head of Swedish police, that the environments have been growing, and we have about 2,000 jihadists. We have about 700 right-wing extremists and 300 left-wing extremists. That was in 2017. Excuse me, the numbers haven't changed very much, but there has been an increase in radical milieux. Society has been polarized, etc. Go ahead, next one. We did a study in 2017, of course, because people also were traveling to Syria. And not many people from the Central Asian community were part of that. But there were a couple, individual cases. But this is the statistics in relation to Swedish foreign fighters who went to Syria. We had data from the Swedish Security Service. You can see a huge amount of women going down as well from Sweden out of the 300. The average age is probably around the same as the rest of Europe. Interestingly, 75% were Swedish citizens, but only 34% were born in Sweden. And most of them came from 4 cities, and they lived in socially deprived sort of different areas. Go on, next slide. And you can see here that most, I'm not sure if you have very good eyesight, you can probably see the years. It starts with 2012, then it goes to 2013. 2013 is a real big spike in the number of people who are going down. So the blue line is going down. The orange line is going back to Sweden. So you can see people are going back and forth all the time. But you can see by 2015, almost, most of the people left in 2013, 2014. Next picture. Now, sometimes we talk about the dangers of foreign fighters, returnees, and so on. I just wanted to show this picture that, out of 300, may not sound very much, but the person on the right there is Osama Krayem, and he was just convicted in France for participating in the terror attacks in Paris, and he's now on trial in Brussels. You can go to the next slide. In Western Europe, not just in Sweden, and I've used Sweden now as an example, but in all of Europe, we have to think about not just individuals who are drawn to this environment, but we also have to think about what I call the Salafi ecosystem or the Salafi jihadi ecosystem. It begins with, you have different hierarchies, different roles and functions. We have preachers, we have mosques, that are problematic, who have foreign funding. We have radicalizers, we have logisticians, we have those that finance the environments, we have those that create encapsulated communities like schools and kindergartens. We have those that maybe be part of it. If you see it in the picture there, it says Dawa. That is the project READ, Lease in German, which is a transnational Saudi-financed Salafi community, which draws a lot of radical individuals. It's outlawed in Germany, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the leader of that person is right now in Malaysia, on the run from the authorities. We have charities, we have NGOs, we have activities for children, summer camps, Quran schools, etc. So you have to think about this space in relation to radicalization within migrant communities as an ecosystem. If you only look at the individuals, you're going to miss a lot of sort of different elements. And of course, there's crossover elements to criminal elements. Go ahead, next one. In Sweden, we've had, if you look at the top of the pyramid of the apex, we've had some key individuals who have been detained following security service interventions in 2019. Most of them are related to each other, either by friendship or by kinship. You also see someone from Chechnya there, Viktor Gizayev. All these names, by the way, have been in the public domain, so I'm not revealing any great secrets here. But Viktor Gizayev has been part and parcel of a radical environment within one of the cities in Sweden, linked to the most well-known radical imams. All these people are non-Swedish citizens, and they are about to be expelled. Some of them have expelled themselves to Turkey, so they are right now in Turkey. Two of them are in Turkey. The top two left ones are in Turkey. But it illustrated that these communities were very much interrelated. Go ahead, next one. And this is really what I wanted to come to, is that we also have had it's been primarily a Caucasus, Chechen network that has been sort of active in relation to creating networks that have been interlinked to other European points. You have Aidamirov. He received asylum in Sweden 2007. Interestingly, he is one of those only persons who have been by gunpoint forcibly rescued from migration custody as he was waiting to be sort of expelled. He was convicted also, prosecuted and convicted for the fact that his son traveled to Syria, joined Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Sham, and he was convicted also of instructing his son of building different explosive devices, etc. So he was prosecuted for giving advice how to escape prison in Syria. You've had also people connected to Caucasus Emirate and so on. Now, the Central Asian or the Caucasus clusters are mainly either in the city up there. You see Strömsund on the right-hand corner. That's a far north city. There had been clustering there primarily because you had there was a very prominent imam who based himself there. He lived in Strömsund in 2006, 2012. He was very prominent, very high on the, should we say, on the list of Uzbek authorities. He survived an assassination attempt that was allegedly connected to Uzbekistan. People were convicted, or one person was convicted for life for this assassination attempt. But you can see there from the clusters that they are clustering in different cities and creating insular communities. Most of them are mainly not Central Asian, in some sense Central Asian, Uzbek, but the clusters in Stockholm, Gävle, Sandviken, Avesta, Växjö, they are primarily also from the with the background in Chechnya and from the Chechen causes. One exception, of course, is David Idison. You see the person in the right-hand corner. He was convicted for, first he was convicted for planning, promoting a plot in Stockholm, but he was convicted to 4 months prison for terror finance. It was him and other co-conspirators were planning to, over facilitating financing, and had contacts with people in IS and Syria. Next one. I have 4 more slides. I'm going to be very quick. So I wouldn't say that the Central Asian communities are very large, or they do not have a lot of activity in relation to, you know, constituting large radicalization factors. But they are there. They are very insular, and they do represent a challenge in relation to law enforcement and prosecution. I just want to list 4 or 5 challenges in relation to how do you respond in general, but also in relation to specifically these communities. The first one, as a researcher, you always have to list, we need more interdisciplinary research. We need to understand the flows between migrant communities, radicalization within these communities, how it functions between cities, within cities, nationally. There are hierarchies, but also, more importantly, transnationally. More and more we speak in Europe, particularly in relation to all these different communities, about hotspots. Some of these groupings are very good at, should we say, criminal enterprise. They have a huge violent capital or threat of violence in the background, reputation for violence, which makes them very effective. There is a huge connection to crime. Sometimes we divide up the so-called crime-terror nexus. I would say they are enmeshed always, from what we are seeing. And of course, there are lots of other different issues that we need to sort of develop more knowledge about. Next picture. Financing is really interesting, because we see, if we talk about the Central Asian diaspora, if we talk about those groups that are linked to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or connected to that, they really are exploiting the welfare state, where they are establishing companies, they are committing different, they're establishing legitimate companies, but they're also, participating in fraud in some cases, and they are distributing money quickly from Sweden to other countries where they can more easily distribute them back to their home countries or wherever they want it to go. This is a huge challenge in Sweden, I think, because there are lots of different financial taps that they can tap into. Next one. Of course, the vicinity or proximity to Turkey, I'm not going to dwell on this, but we also have a problem with ISIS returnees And this is not just in relation to sort of Central Asia. There were, of course, people who traveled to ISIS, etc. They are based now in Syria or in Turkey and so on. So what do you do about them? Given the current situation in Russia and Ukraine, etc., it's overshadowed this whole dimension about ISIS and the future of ISIS and the future of this whole situation and the problems that we're facing for the future. Linking me to the next slide, which is the issue of what do we do with prison and probation, people being both criminals but also violent extremists being groomed within prison systems. How do we re-socialize them? How do we create exit programs, etc.? And of course, this is the big danger, I think, in Europe in relation to this area. And next one slide. And this is maybe a very specific Swedish problem, but I know it's a broader European problem. I mean, yes, you find people who have sought asylum or part maybe of migrant communities who commit crime, who are not citizens. What do you do about them in terms of can you expel them back to their home countries without violating, fundamental human rights issues? Can you get diplomatic guarantees? How do you balance security and civil liberties? There is a huge shadow community of the asylum seekers or others who are not allowed to stay in the country, but who have gone underground. And I think this is a European-wide sort of issue. And it also links to sort of the final one. Can you remove citizenship for someone? You can see here on the left-hand side, Said Mansour was the person who organized the Danish Salafi jihadi community, and they actually removed his Danish citizenship. He has a Moroccan one, and he was expelled to Morocco in 2019. On those very depressing notes, but let me say on the optimistic note, from where we are sitting, the Central Asian community is not, I mean, they are here, and of course a tiny minority of them may belong or have connections to violent jihadi communities. Difficult to actually break through to these environments, to these communities, but it's not a massive problem in relation to this, but it's something that we need to keep. As we've seen in some of the cases, we need to keep an eye on. On that note, I hand it over. Next slide. So thank you for listening to this issue, and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Magnus, for that really fascinating look at the scene in Sweden in particular, but touching specifically on this sort of Central Asian angle. And I'm aware it's a part of the sort of story in Sweden, but thank you for really bringing it out and highlighting some of the Caucasus links and other aspects. And I think there's lots there to sort of unpick and pull at, and I'm sure we'll come to that. And I also see a number of questions have already popped up in the chat box, but I'm going to hold on to those because before that, I want to turn it over to Ms. Indira Aslanova, who is Assistant Professor, UNESCO Chair of World Culture and Religions at the Kyrgyz Russian Slavic University, and leading specialist at Search for Common Ground, whose logo she is proudly displaying behind her, and co-founder at the Research Center for Religious Studies in Kyrgyzstan, who is going to give us really a view of these questions from the region. And we're very appreciative, Dr. Aslanova, for you taking the time to join us. And I will hand it over to you to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. Let me express my gratitude and say how honored I am to be a part of today's webinar. And thank you for inviting. So as was mentioned, my background is in religious studies. I am not a diaspora specialist. I work with the religious motivated extremism and terrorism, and like last maybe 5 years work at the Kyrgyzstan prisons interviewing foreign terrorist fighters or others who were sentenced for extremism crimes or violent extremism crimes. So, and today I want to more reflect on that researches that was done and complement with other researchers that was done in the let's say in the Russia on the labor migrants. I will share my presentation. Just a second. Yeah. Now I understand why I was asked to send my presentation before. Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, we can. I think if you just enlarge it maybe to fill the screen, but it's looking very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, yeah, a little bit background. Kyrgyzstan, yeah, I'm not going to focus on the whole Central Asia. The Kyrgyzstan will be a case study, but with the element of the Central Asian trends. So the Kyrgyzstan is one of the world's most remittance-dependent country, and it's nearly almost like 1/5 of the population who is working abroad is labor migrants, and there are 3 main destinations of this. It's Russia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. And internal and external migration in Kyrgyzstan are most often raised in the context of economic problems, high unemployment, really low wage. And just recently, experts and policymakers started to think about this link between the migration, religion, and particularly this correlation with extremism and radicalizations. And researchers claim that there is some, that many Central Asians experience radicalization when they work abroad as a labor migrants, because there is some circumstances, some environment that make them more vulnerable to the radicalization. So there is 3 research that I want to focus on. One was done in 2080 together with RUSI and Search for Common Ground in Russia, based on interviewing more than 200 labor migrants from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Sorry. The next one is research that was conducted in 2021 in the Kyrgyzstan prisons. It's based on interviewing almost 40 foreign terrorist fighters and 20 their relatives. And the aim was to understand why people is deciding to go and join some extremist groups, terrorist groups in the Middle East, how they're doing this and why they deciding to return back. And the third one is on radicalization online. Here we try to identify not only the violent extremist narratives that are disseminated in the social networks, but also why in some cases these narratives are effective. So I guess I believe that each study complements each other and shed lights on the what we call risk of radicalization. For example, okay, let me call for the sake of the time. The first one is a RUSI research, next one FTF research, and this one is an online research. So the RUSI research was focused on perception of factors contributing to violent extremism, and then the causal factors leading to violent extremism. Because at that time, researchers due to different reasons, didn't have access to the violent extremists. So the second foreign terrorist fighters research filling this gap. And for again, the first research also give the perception of individual incentives for engaging with violent extremism, and other studies confirm or sometimes challenge these findings. Okay. So what we are going to do, we are going to go through the structural motivations, enabling factors in violent extremism, individual incentives for engaging at most at-risk and vulnerable group to violent extremism, and sources of resilience. So for the structural motivation, there is no clear evidence of direct link between the marginalization of labor migrants and the push factors driving them to join violent extremist groups. Registration challenges, economic and financial hardship, stigmatization, and securitization. This was mentioned that can impact the process of radicalization, but not necessarily determinants of the taking place. And this was also confirmed by the FTF research, where this lack of the social protection, high level of intolerance, and all this together pushed people, some of the representatives of the diaspora or labor migrants to look for the better life, for the justice. And these recruiters use this to give them like alternative meaning of life and the possibility of finding happiness. Like they give them the chance to restore their self-worth. And also I have like a citations from the interview that one of the FTF mentioned that it was really challenging to stay in Turkey for more than 6 months. In one case, you will be subject for the law enforcement to look for and check. On the other hand, the community that is there also like trying to influence you and to indoctrinate in some cases. Enabling factors. For the enabling factors, there was a perception that so there is not really good evidence that extremists deliberately recruiting Central Asian labor migrants in Russia. And our research shows that only that it also do not give this evidence, but it says that the migration makes sense. Only 10% of the interviews stated that they were recruited in the Kyrgyzstan. Other 90% were recruited when they were abroad, and mostly it was Russia, Turkey, less Kazakhstan. Also some mentioned Ukraine and South Korea. South Korea, it's really interesting case, and I will come back to this later on also. Again, from the RUSI research, we had the information that there is lack of understanding what kind of groups are operating, recruiting the people, what are these networks. From these researches, we see now that these groups were, if we would talk about 2040, like the early ages, Central Asians were mostly recruited by the Chechen or other Caucasus, and it was like the mosque. They were get the first information, and they in the beginning joined this Saifullah Shishani group, but in the middle, like a few years after, when the Central Asians gained some support or experience in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, They were more connected to the Jabhat al-Nusra and affiliated groups. These groups are like Hayatul Tawhid wal Jihad group, Imam Kita, I forgot the name. So the groups that are affiliated with the Jabhat al-Nusra, and it's like about 80% of this, and less ISIS, less some other groups. And if we will talk about the reasons or motivation, one of this is that Jabhat al-Nusra group had one of the Kyrgyz prominent recruiter who become a well-known figure there, and who used his connections, who used his networks from the country to recruit others. Another interesting thing here to think about is how they use these narratives to recruit, because if ISIS was talking about creating a caliphate, Jabhat al-Nusra was his propaganda was based on the idea of helping to other Muslims, to help those who are under the oppression of Assad regime, from Shia groups. And it has a different level of engagement from the labor migrants overall, from the Central Asians. And also this one of the enabling factors was the perception of the enabling factor was that they are adopting a global Islamic identity, and this potentially makes them more susceptible to mobilization for international causes. Yes, this was used, this religion and Islamic identity was used to creating strong in-group identity, and the family, understanding of the family was expanded for the understanding of the Ummah. And the second strong narrative was the obligation to protect your family, meaning to protect your Ummah. And those who were in Syria, in Iraq, like the suffering Muslims, were framed as the brothers and sisters, and that this is a duty of the man, like one part of this masculinity. The duty of the man is to protect them, to go there. And at the same time, the outgroup identity also was created, that those who are not supporting us, they are enemies, they are kafirs, murtads, and others. Here a little bit about the hotspots. As you see, like the 90%, no, 95% of the foreign terrorist fighters that we interviewed were from the south part of the Kyrgyzstan, from these districts. And this Sirajuddin Mukhtarov, or Abu Salah, he was the leader of the Khatibat al-Bukhari group, who used his networks here he also from the south part, he used his networks to recruit but number of people from the Kyrgyzstan. And about the motivation. So the perception was that finance are the main motive to join these groups, and religion as well, but less duty to defend Muslims in Syria. So what our research also shows is that almost, you see, like 42% of interviews said that for them it was help to Muslim. So the decision to engage was triggered mostly with the emotional with the emotional narratives rather than the rational one. A minority, about 8%, that said about the curiosity, that this was the desire of the adventure, especially like the prospect of participating in the real war, or at least have a look what is happening there. So one of the interviews mentioned that there was even like not internal organized tours in Turkey to go to the border and see what is going on in Syria. And in the early ages, they were taking a picture of them with the gun. And then these pictures was used against them in the court. The predominant narrative, as I said, used by recruiters was about this sense of Muslims suffering, of children being raped in front of their parents, women killed, children killed, and most of the FTFs mentioned this as a main trigger, main emotional trigger that make them have a decision to go and to join some group. Also, what is interesting that mass media, the news, were the first aroused their interest to this what is happening in Syria. And as they said, after the news, they started to search and look what is going on there and come up with these videos. And also, like I said, we had more people engaged with the Jabhat al-Nusra, who was in confront with the ISIS. And this lots of counter narratives that was a part of the counter extremism, violent extremism program. Counter narratives against the ISIS were used by the Jabhat leaders to recruit people to the Jabhat al-Nusra. I mean, like we had, in one hand, we had the effect that people were not joining ISIS, but they were joining the opposite group. And yes, religious identity also play a role, and religious motivations, but they were more like cementing all this rather than being the first motivation to go. Who might be most at risk and vulnerable to violent extremism? And I guess this is really a philosophical question that we will never get an answer. There is no typical profile of violent extremist or some pre-existing vulnerability to radicalization. I'm really skeptical about profiling methods that are used, having some picture of the typical extremist, the violent extremist or terrorist, because the motivations differs, level of indoctrination differs, and I guess, like, even from our research, we didn't find any clinical, any mental health issues. There was only one case where the person had a mental health issues. They are different age group, different level of their education, and what surprised me that most of them wasn't really religious. They were indoctrinated with idea of saving these poor people in Syria, in Iraq. They were like a few percent of people who was really indoctrinated with the idea of creating caliphate, but they were not religious literate. Only one person had some religious education before. That's why I'm still think that it's really hard, if not impossible, to have one profile of the extremist and terrorist. in terms of our countries, this kind of profiling leads to the demonization or criminalization of the really common for the religious groups issues, like praying in the some way or not praying in the Sunnah or other. So yeah. Sources for resilience. What we find is that family played a great role both in radicalization and disengagement. In radicalization, when some of them were radicalized by the family members, by the uncle, or by the husband radicalizing wife. But the role of family in disengagement, in decision to leave the conflict zone, in the decision to leave the organization, was a really huge, and especially the role of the mother. And also the local communities and their support. I guess this is something that will definitely help one in preventing them to go and being radicalized, and on the other hand, helping in their rehabilitation and resocialization. So as for now, we're really taking into account this group affiliation and the motives of joining the extremist group, because it gives us completely different picture of their rehabilitation programming. And we are now really trying to pay less attention to religious rehabilitation, because as I said, not all of them really religiously indoctrinated. But if we will introduce this religious rehabilitation, it can lead to the indoctrinating these people there in the prison. And yeah, and also this affiliation with the organization, meaning that we have to understand how the group was operating, how they were, what was their main narratives. And this is different from the Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And again, this role of if we will talk about the diaspora there, the role, if there is a ties between this community, it will create more resilience for their radicalization. Why we think they were more vulnerable in the being abroad, being as a labor migrants, because they had less network there, like no family members, no friends, no others, familiars who usually like suggest you to have a step back, to think a little bit before making a decision. So I guess I will stop here. Yeah. My apologies if I messed up something, because like I'm usually not doing presentations in English, and for me it's always challenging.
Indira, you messed absolutely nothing up. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for doing it. It was very clear. I think you raised a number of points that were very interesting, looking at the specific impact of the kind of labor migrant experience and how this is training through to radicalization. And I think your points about resilience at the end are very welcome to sort of highlight some of the protective factors that exist. And so thank you very much for doing that and for bringing that up. And that was really an excellent compliment to Magnus's presentation, looking at what we see happen in Europe. So, well, specifically Sweden, really. Well, we have now a good half an hour for questions and discussion. And I see we've already been flooded with questions in the chat box function. So what I hope our speakers will do is, forgive me, I will try to cluster them a little bit and steer them towards you. But I think first there's a few which are very specific to Magnus about Sweden. So I might tackle those ones first.
Sure.
And then some of the other ones, which can be applicable to both, I think I'll throw it to both of you. But in the meantime, if anyone else has any questions, please do continue to feed them in, because we do have a good amount of time. So Magnus, if I can start with you and throw you three very specific ones. Well, I'm going to group two together immediately, but three that
I can see them on the
you can see them on the thing. I don't even need to read it to you, do I? But maybe just to flag up the ones that I'd like you to touch on. The first one is the one about are all the Muslim clerics in Sweden foreigners, and other efforts to promote local Swedish-born naturalized Central Asian imams who better understand, or others, I suppose, who better understand Swedish culture and society, and will that help Central Asian migrants better integrate into society? And then maybe to that one as well, if we could group the one that comes a little later, can you name some of the prominent preachers and radicalizers from the Salafi ecosystem that you mentioned, and what efforts there have been by the government to deal with them? So that's sort of one question. I think you touched on some of those names.
I'll be very brief because it's very specific to Sweden. I'm sorry to sort of, I'm not a tourist board for Sweden. With talking about,
I'm not sure this is the part of Sweden that the tourist board would want to promote.
I'm not sure the embassy would like to hear this, but let me say, are all the Muslim clerics in Sweden foreigners? Of course they're not. There are lots of different orientations, and most. I mean, we have the ones that I listed have been publicly named. And they are the ones that have been mostly problematic. They were mainly problematic also because they were in charge of schools with hundreds of pupils, and they were very, very clearly anti-democratic, had connections to other. So we're dealing with quite a small proportion. Most of them are not problematic, and there are different orientations and different issues. So I just want to sort of make that clear. We are dealing with a very small number of individuals. Are there efforts to promote local Swedish-born or naturalized Central Asian imams? I don't know about Central Asian ones, but in general, we are struggling with, because we are a very secular society. You know, I don't know if you know this chart with Inglehart World Values Survey, where you have collectivism, individualism, religiosity on different charts. Sweden is very extreme. You know, we are very highly individual and not very religious. And that makes it very difficult for immigrant communities to come in, because sometimes, of course, they have parallel ways of doing things, which come into conflict with the laws. They may have courts, they have tribunals, etc., for within their sort of community issues. I think it's very difficult to break through in some of those areas, because we have left, in some areas, we have let segregation, you know, become too large, and therefore it's easier to rely on those structures. So just focusing in on imams and that they can. Yes, it's an important dimension, but we need to have broader issues that makes people come into contact with different cultures. So I think I've answered most of those. What the Swedish security services have done is to tackle the imams. First of all, they're not citizens, so they can be expelled, and they have been processed through a court system or a migration court system. Secondly, they have tackled them financially. If you tackle these ecosystems' financial viability or sustenance, then you know it's difficult for anyone to be able to maintain the same level of activity. So you have to work, but you have to, of course, work with repressive means, targeting financing, and you have to sync that, which doesn't often happen, with prevention. So how do you prevent the community? How do you include the community, and so on? So it's difficult. You know, this was a difficult talk to give, Raffaello, because you know, the Central Asian community doesn't make a lot of sound. They are, you know, many of them are hardworking. They live in their communities. They they're not involved in any of this sort of activity. But of course, the cases that we have show that there are individuals connected to violent extremist movements, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, other movements who have sought refuge here, who become like honeypot, they become like a lighthouse. And the cases I showed you on that picture, I'm sure you can watch it in retrospect. We had an imam who moved to this really rural area, and it created, I mean, this is a very small community. I mean, we're talking about 5,000-10,000 people living in this area, and you have huge, sizable community. And right now within that community, I just looked right before I came on today, the security services is sort of monitoring 6 individuals within that community who are sort of violence promoting, who are deemed a national security threat. So of course it has a huge impact. From what I hear now, community, you also have a Somali community that's relatively insular. So you have 2 communities that have very strong sort of community regulations that live side by side within a secular community that don't understand them, they don't know how to reach them, and so on. And of course you have clashes, and that's the big issue. And I see here a question about, let me just sort of dish that off right away. We have had a new government, yes. And of course everyone thinking, well, what's happening in Sweden and so on. Sweden Democrats is, they have roots before within neo-Nazism. Let's not beat around the bush about that. But they have become, sizable political party, and they are not in government. The government may cooperate with them, but they're not going to get any minister posts and so on. So, I mean, it's a problem across Europe. We see this right-wing populism. We see right-wing populism. We see the inability of governments to foster, like in Singapore, intercommunal harmony, intercommunal relations, live side by side. We have a lot to learn in Europe from our southern neighbors and so on, of how do you do this in a very constructive way, and how do we appreciate that? So I think that's a big challenge for Europe for the future.
Thank you for that, Magnus. That was another one I wanted you to tackle kind of directly, because I'm not sure, Indira, if you have any thoughts about Swedish elections, but I suspected not. But maybe, Indira, I'll put a question to you before I go back to another one for Magnus directly. This is looking at, most of the Kyrgyz citizens who have fought in Syria and Iraq are ethnic Uzbeks. And there has been a kind of general, problem or question in Kyrgyzstan around radicalization emanating mostly from sort of southern communities in particular. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of these differences of radicalization within Kyrgyzstan, and if we're seeing radicalization amongst the sort of Kyrgyz population rather than the sort of Kyrgyz Uzbek population, and if you see any of that stretching into the diaspora questions as well. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on that sort of very Kyrgyz particular question, but a very interesting one.
Yeah, I guess, like, first of all, why usually Uzbek was more strengthened in their discourse, Uzbek population. And I guess this is not only the question about the 2010 conflict, but it's also about the region where they are living. And this is the most populated region in Kyrgyzstan. And that's why I guess even the percentage of their migration and being involved in some group will be a little bit higher than for the rest Kyrgyz population. But I don't want to stigmatize, because that's why we are trying to avoid this Uzbek Kyrgyz specific, because there was a really stigmatization of the community. And that Of course, we're a country. We have our corruption and other not perfect system that also affects this side of. For the Kyrgyz, this is just my observation. I do not rely to exact numbers, do not rely to the exact research findings, because as I said, we try to separate between, not to separate, make like one vision. My observation is that Kyrgyz population were less involved to the Jabhat al-Nusra side, because as I said, Sirajuddin Mukhtarov, he used his network and it was like an umbrella for all the group. But we had them more involved to the group calling Yaqin Inkar and Tabligh Jamaat in Kyrgyzstan. And there was a problems with the migrants in Russia, because Tabligh Jamaat is a group that prohibited in Russia and in the list of the extremist groups, but not prohibited in Kyrgyzstan. And they feel like the books, when they traveled with the Tabligh Jamaat books, they were arrested in Russia. And also, if we will go to the strictly violent extreme terrorist groups, yes, I interviewed less Kyrgyz because I get access less to Kyrgyz. The more Uzbek was in the prison. But again, this is not a question that they're more vulnerable to radicalization. This is a question that's the system works like this. Yeah, and also, so yeah, I had more ISIS belong Kyrgyz than Uzbeks. But this is just an observation. I don't want to make a statement. This is like this.
No, understood. And I think your point about sensitivities is clearly important, because stigmatization is certainly a huge problem. And, when we're thinking about migrant communities, and both of you mentioned this, one of the big problem is they are already strangers in the land that they're in. And to have this added element just creates an additional tension within society, which of course we want to avoid. But thank you for that really interesting snapshot into the Kyrgyz system in particular. I'm going to try to group a couple of questions together, because we had a few questions that kind of touch on a similar thing, and I'll put them to both of you. I'll maybe ask Magnus to cover it first, and then Indira, if you have any points. The first is, within a Salafi ideological ecosystem, is it possible to encourage the pietist and non-violent Salafis to speak out, to delegitimize the violent jihadist narratives? And I want to add to this another question which has been put, which is, there is an argument that non-violent extremism might have a role in radicalization. There are others who say not at all. And, I wonder if you have any thoughts. And I'm conscious these aren't identical, but they are similar questions, and they are scratching at the same itch, if you will. So Magnus, what do you think?
Well, thank you for lobbing that very difficult question at me, and I will try to answer it. The issue about the purist, the non-violent activists versus the Salafi jihadists, it exists along an ideological spectrum. And I recently had a 7-hour session with the person who recruited most of the foreign fighter, or radicalized, not recruited, sorry, radicalized most of the foreign fighters in Gothenburg, which was the epicenter in Sweden. And so I put it to him because he was a Salafi, and he is a Salafi. And I said, look, on this spectrum, it is the same sort of foundational ideological foundation. And can you move between different spheres? And he said, absolutely. I was a purist, and then I moved to becoming a Salafi jihadist. Now I've moved back to becoming a purist. So yes, there are purists who are speaking out against violence and so on. But I think, there is a strict division between the violence dimension, but there is, within a sort of liberal democratic society, there are problems in relation to the purist position, in relation to what do the Salafi purists think about democracy, gender equality, etc. I mean, we have to understand that this is a very ultra-orthodox religious orientation that do not believe in bid'ah, in innovation, and do not and have a very black and white view of what is permissible, what is not permissible. So therefore, the answer, yes, there are people who are speaking out against this, who are Salafi, but at the same time, there are many who are jihadi, and you can move in the spectrum. The other question was, what was the other question? About the non-violent and violent, the connection. Now, I wouldn't say don't listen to me. I would say that, don't listen to me. Listen to the security service and others who are monitoring this. And I can say from the Swedish security position, this is service position, they've been talking about 2 waves, and they talk about the wave from the back, the big wave that is pushing the smaller wave. The smaller wave being the violent extremism. The other is the non-violent dimensions of Islamism that is pushing the bigger wave forward. That's creating the torque, the nourishment. And there is, yes, there are connections, but they're quite complicated. They're quite complicated in terms of, and it has maybe less to do with the violence, because you see the violence. It has more to do with confrontations within liberal democratic societies. So you have different kind of battles going on in terms of talking about the ideological, should we say, competition that happens within society. And there one has to sort of, I mean, we see from where I'm sitting that the kind of narratives, the kind of connections and so on is not always clear cut. There can be overlapping spheres of non-violent Islamist extremism with violent extremism. We see now a big drive of trying to silence debate about Islamism. And they usually use Islamophobia as the tool. Now there is Islamophobia within Western society and so on. So it's a really murky world. How to disentangle this, unpack this in a factual, constructive way is really difficult. But yes, there is a connection between non-violent and violent Islamist extremism. Most security services would say that, but of course you have to look at it individually based. And there's definitely a problem in relation to fundamental individual rights and freedoms and equality that we haven't really addressed, particularly within liberal democratic society. So we have to learn how to live with it, but also how to confront it without creating polarization.
That's a very tall order you're setting, Magnus, but I think you captured the problem substantially. Indira, what do you think?
So the first question was about using non-violent Salafists to counter narrative, to counter violent Salafists. I like the idea, but it depends where we're doing this. Because if it's like an open network where we have a risk to radicalize others, not at all violent Muslims. But we suggested this as a part of the rehabilitation program to the violent extremist prisoners. So the first step was the categorization, and if we see this is like a really violent, not just a stick not just the stigma of the being foreign terrorist fighters, but it's the indoctrinated who participated in some violent acts and others, and who is really indoctrinated. This is the first religiously indoctrinated. So the idea was to provide them with the literature of non-violent Salafist groups who have the same idea but do not use the violence for this. And this is like a step-by-step rehabilitation program, but it was prohibited to use these books for the other less radicalized prisoners. You see, so it depends where we are using this, and we should be really careful about this, and it should be all the time monitored and be under control. It's for the first question. For the second question, it's about using
connection between non-violent and...
Yes, exactly. Non-violent extremists and violent.
Yeah. So the example, I will just give an example. If you remember this map of the Kyrgyzstan with the hotspots. So these hotspots usually a place where mostly Hizb ut-Tahrir is operating. So, and not even the idea, but maybe the vision is that it appears that this idea of caliphate was already socialized there. So maybe that this Hizb ut-Tahrir was operating there for the years. They have, they indoctrinated this community with the Islamist, political Islam ideas. And they were like more, not vulnerable, but for them it was something familiar when they were hearing this argumentation of them more, the recruiters.
Thank you for that, Indira. A very specific example, which I think illustrates the problem very well. We have a few more questions. There's another very specific one to Magnus, which I'll throw out there, and then I'll follow it with another one that maybe both of you can touch on, which is you made a brief mention of Malaysia in your presentation, Magnus.
Yeah.
And of course, one of my astute colleagues heard it and said, Malaysia. I went. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that particular connection, maybe the organization, the name. And then just very briefly, the question to both of you, just so maybe Indira can think about it a little bit first, and Magnus, you can tackle it, would be, what would be a key difference between preachers and radicalizers, in the sense that preachers are usually said to be radicalized as well? I know this is like semantic conversation, but it's an interesting question, I think, to sort of pry into, that if there is a distinction between those two roles. So Magnus, over to you.
Well, first of all, I have fond memories of being in Singapore, and I remember during that time that there was also discussions about the role of Iran across the border in Malaysia. Now, the question wasn't about that. It was about the organization I showed that was conducting dawah. And maybe that's a good illustration of the fact of the linkages between non-violent and violent. In other words, they may appear to be non-violent, but they may indeed be very anti-democratic and violent. The organization's name was Die Wahre Religion in German, German-based transnational Dawah organization funded by Saudi Arabia originally, existing in many different countries, outlawed in Germany, the reason why that organization became very interesting and also problematic was that it was outlawed in Germany. They turned up in Sweden and tried to radicalize the community. So many of the persons who were distributing Qurans and so on were actually the more problematic Salafi, jihadi promoting persons. When the organization was outlawed, the leader, Abu Nagi, is believed to have gone to Malaysia and is being based in Malaysia. It's not the organization itself, but maybe the person. On the second issue was that there was also discussions in relation to, during the time of ISIS, that there were different transit points out of Syria and becoming involved and so on. Malaysia was one of them. Other countries were in North Africa. So I guess, you know, the issue is that it's important to deal with violent extremism, to deal with individuals seeking refuge in different areas. I don't want to make a big thing out of it. It may be just that the person just turned up there, but it is important that all countries do their duty according to UN resolutions. When it comes to, sorry, the other question was preachers and radicalizers. Well, preachers are very, should we say, prominent, and of course, in Sweden they have been very careful. In many parts of Europe, they've been very careful. They know they are being watched, but they may be speaking with one voice to one audience and then another voice with another audience. The radicalizers are the ones who are organizing the things, who are maybe in the mosque, but are, I mean, of course, the preachers can also be radicalizing if they have the ability to be able to speak openly. But the you know, these are mainly the sort of the logisticians who are organizing or radicalizing, who are seeing to it that how is the message received, that maybe the preachers are communicating, but also how are they organizing this ecosystem locally.
Excellent. Thank you. Indira, on the second question, unless you have views on Malaysia, I suppose.
You know, I remember when this conceptualization around violent extremism started, and we all the time was struggling with the words, like not to use extremism, use violent extremism, not use radicalism, use radicalization. This is a process. And now we have radicalizers, frankly speaking, don't know. Like for me, preacher from the world of preach, and even like the violent extremist also preaching for his extremist view of religion, of ideology, whatever. So I can't answer. Sorry.
I think you did anyway, Indira. So thank you very much for that. That's excellent. Look, we've got a little bit of time left, and in the last question, I'll put to you both, and maybe I'll do it the other order to let Indira lead and get Magnus give a moment to think. It is a kind of more forward-looking one, which is, you know, of course, the big issue at the moment in sort of international security is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course has an impact on the Caucasus, on Central Asia, on diasporas, on everything. I wonder if you could comment on what you think the likely impact is going to be, or what is the impact you've seen already on sort of questions around radicalization, specifically amongst Central Asians and Caucasians, or people from the North Caucasus, sorry, that you've seen from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Indira, I'll let you start.
So we already have some cases when, but now it calls not foreign terrorist fighters, now it calls foreign fighters from Central Asia who are either on the Russian side or in the Ukrainian side. You have to understand, like, we're still living in the post-Soviet space, so with the Russian media covering like a whole region, and there is a big split between the population. Some is really supporting the Russian one, another is the Ukrainian one, and already there is a video with the information from Russia, because they was like calling for mobilization. A lot of Kyrgyz diaspora who have like a joint citizenship of Kyrgyzstan and Russia now also being mobilized to go to Ukraine. I can't say what kind of implications it might be, but we already have a big shift of people coming back from Russia, of migrants, even Russians coming to Kyrgyzstan and trying to avoid this. But what I do interested in terms of being a researcher, it's how this narrative about foreign terrorist fighters now shifting for the narrative of the foreign fighters, you know, and they have a different implications and different colors. And this is interesting to search further. So it depends if in what side you are to be claimed as a foreign terrorist fighters or foreign fighters. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira. And Magnus, over to you.
Well, we live in a tough neighborhood. I mean, Russia is very close by to us, and it is, of course, also to in the post-Soviet space. We're seeing this as we speak. I mean, we saw that we need to join NATO, and we're trying to join NATO. Luckily, hopefully, Turkey will allow us to take the final step. I'm convinced that they will allow us. Of course, I mean, there are two aspects to this. First of all, it's about hybrid warfare, the Russian hybrid warfare. As we speak, we have the gas pipelines, the Nord Stream and so on, just around, well, within territorial waters that are being sabotaged. And, you know, as Putin may be more pressured, he may become also more unpredictable in many ways. But this sort of hybrid warfare has always been there, but it's been really put to the test now. How does it impact this sort of whole domain? Well, one is that, you know, Russia may be able to exploit its connections to right-wing extremists in Europe. But also there are people streaming to the conflict, and some of them are not very nice people with very unsavory ideological connections, right-wing. And you know, there is a sort of somewhat of a discussion what will happen when they come back, but it's less of an issue. I cannot speak about how the Central Asian community, because I haven't seen anything, I haven't spoken to them. It would be wrong for me to say anything about it, but we can say that, you know, as people streaming from Russia to Central Asia or coming back, the borders are now closing. Finland has just closed their border to Russians and so on. So, I mean, the stakes are being higher now. And really, there are so many unpredictable factors in relation to this. And this, of course, this whole situation has overshadowed the whole issue about foreign terrorist fighters and ISIS, future. You know, lots of other geopolitical things are happening already that is being played out. So to tell you the truth, Raffaello, I don't know. But it's an interesting time to be a researcher and to think about these things.
Well, thank you for that. I think, you know, Magnus, if we did know and you had a perfect answer, then I think you'd probably be a very rich man, because predicting the future is a very lucrative sport to get into. So, but thank you both really so much for giving us some really thoughtful answers and some angles on particular last question and what it might look like going forwards. And more broadly for engaging on this question of radicalization amongst diasporas, and specifically on Central Asia, and how that plays out in the European Swedish context, and specifically in the case of Kyrgyzstan. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This presentation has all been recorded, as we all know, and will be uploaded onto the RSIS site. So lots more people will be able to see it. We'll be sure to share it with you afterwards, and so you can more directly share it with your own networks and do other things and spread the word widely. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Before I pull stumps, I would remind people again to please sign up if you're not already, because we have got another one in this series coming up looking at South Asia, which I think will be really interesting. And we'll focus in particular on some of the South Asian questions and links to Southeast Asia and back to Europe. And then, of course, I should thank my wonderful ICPVTR colleagues who helped make this event happen, in particular our colleague Nodir, who helped coordinate the entire thing, and colleagues who helped, Imran and others who helped manage the actual event. So thank you all very much. Thank you again to Indira and Magnus, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you both in Singapore at some time or somewhere else. So, thank you all very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.